Hello and welcome to the program. I am Suren. What is the difference between imagination and hallucination? Think about it for a while. Imagination as a function of the primary thinking brain involves experiencing an idea or insight or concept that has not previously been formulated or thought about. Hallucination is a function of the primary sensing brain which involves experiencing what is not there in reality. That is a big difference. According to university studies, we can talk about the altered state of the imagination to start with, as presented once by Daniel Colleton, Elaine Perry, and Alan Robert Bowman. According to findings, there is a strong overlap between imagined and hallucinating phenomena in the sense that both are internal representations of external things that are not present at the time. Relationships between hallucinations and wider aspects of imagination are complex and individual, with a lack of systematic evidence. There appears to be a close relationship between the brain areas responsible for imagined and hallucinatory perception, though more data is needed. However, how activity varies within and outside these areas in order to create different types of imagination is not at all clear. Drug effects provide one avenue for systematically exploring links between hallucinations and imagination. Drugs that cause hallucinations also tend to affect wider imagination and creativity. Low results are variable and are often open to alternative explanations. Nevertheless, these effects suggest that wider, even non-perceptual brain systems are involved in the generation of imaginative responses to hallucinations. Future investigations need to define imagination a little more closely, having perhaps designs and combining approaches and so forth. Now, what are the differences between imagination, illusion, fantasy, and hallucination? Michael Dillard explains thus: imagination is the ability to deliberately form new ideas, new images, or concepts that are not directly present to the apprehension of one's senses. It is an intentional act of mental thought. That's it. An illusion is something wrongly perceived by the senses, sometimes through a deliberate act of deception. Hallucination is an illusion generated by an involuntary act of self-deception, which may result from any number of causes, including organic brain damage, even dehydration, sleep deprivation, mental illness, and a variety of psychopharmaceuticals and other natural substances. Fantasy can have a number of differing definitions, depending on the context, of course. It might be a genre of literature characterized by magic and perhaps supernatural events, places, and people. It might also be a synonym for a hallucination. An example. A fantasy appeared before his eyes, a magical city of brass alone in the desert, or the resulting idea, image, or concept generated by an act of imagination. It might be a delusional belief resulting from the experience of an illusion. Christina Aronson says, with imaginations and fantasy, the person has a chance of knowing that what they are experiencing is not real. They may even have a choice with regard to imagining or fantasizing. They can end the experience if they want to, whenever they want to. With an illusion, however, that may or may not be an awareness that illusion is not real. The illusion often comes into being through circumstances. For instance, the person will simply not realize the truth. Once he or she does, the illusion is shattered. With the hallucination, the person is not aware that it is not real. And he or she has no choice as to whether they hallucinate or not, and they cannot end it at will. The hallucination is usually not caused by the circumstances, but by a state of turmoil and confusion within the person's own mind. Here is yet another question. Can too much visualization or visual imagination lead to hallucinations? Thank you for the question. It is something to think about. Christopher Jordan writes, the difference between imagination and hallucination. The following incident is imagination, where we discover a character in the book that presently rewriting and editing once spoken to me. He had been a mute teenager from Xinjiang and had been scheduled for another story. But for the first time, he spoke to me and said, I am ready to be born. And all I had to do was think. And there he was, having grown taller, turned black, and being given a voice. Now, his name is Dilalat. That is one of those writer things. Other writers claim their characters speak to them often. Sometimes I wish mine would speak to me more, says one. But when they do, as in the example before, I know that they don't exist. My responsibility as a writer is precisely to give characters like him a kind of life, he says. All the others hint a hallucination is what I wanted head-on, LSD, when I thought highly advanced aliens were reading my mind and were becoming aware of me. The difference was that it seemed too real at the time. I talked myself into refusing to believe in the aliens in the hopes that they would ignore me. And since then, they have ignored me, assuming they ever existed in the first place. But at the time, it was hard to tell the difference. And so, if you know it is not real, it is imagination. If you don't know it anymore, it is a hallucination. Lone Wolf wrote once, I think that imagination may be a mild form of hallucination. When I first read C.S. Lewis' Chronicles of Narnia, I could actually see forests, closets, mountains, castles. In fact, while my eyes were still reading the words, it was as if these images washed over reality, and even though I continue to read the words, I continue with this image. The image that was as clear, vivid, and upfront as much as I could see the real world. Much like we ignore our nose, even though it is always in your field of vision, in essence, you don't see it. It was the same with the real world and the text. I saw it, but the image in my head created by my mind was all I perceived. But I also did not have to think in detail what kind of trees would be in the forest, what color are the stones would be on the castle. They just were. I believe them being pulled out from my memories of forest and things I have actually seen. Often, when I imagine something, especially when I am trying to make up a story of my own, I oftentimes no longer see reality. The imagined world and people are all I can see. It is oftentimes a brief flash here and there, the main character I am coming up with standing in a field. Sometimes I can hold it for minutes, depending on how realistic I can make my story. The better it flows, the easier the image stays. Once it becomes a little unbelievable, or I struggle to continue with the plot, the image vanishes. It was the vividness of the visual image that led me to ask myself, am I hallucinating? I have never clearly heard my characters' voices as I hear real people's, but when I think, I often hear my own voice in my head. And I have heard my characters' imagined voices that clearly, even females, even animals in my stories. I have had auditory hallucinations, very really, usually consisting of 1 or 2 words, like someone calling my name, but not related to the usage or my imagination, never. Well, I'm trying to, and mostly during times of stress. I can also become lost in thought, when I'm thinking about a car or any topic. I visualize the thing or associated things, and I sometimes no longer hear the real world or see it or perceive it in any way. It seems the only real difference between the two is duration and control. However, do they activate the same parts of the brain? Are they functionally the same, aside from not being able to end a hallucination on free will, unlike imagination? They seem similar to me, but I have also never had a full-blown hallucination either, that I know of. It would be interesting to see a study of the structures of the brain activated during both situations and see how they compare. Jeff Wright contributes, saying, "It is interesting that the answer to this is pretty much the same as the one regarding imagination and insight. Imagination is the gateway to reality, but we have to walk the path and pass through it. Imagination tells us what is possible. Then we undertake the complex process of matching it with reality. It is a two-way street, with reality guiding imagination and imagination guiding how we perceive reality. All these activities are based on imagination, and we assess and label them retrospectively, depending on what happens. That is in the storyline. If we are clearly right, we call it insight. If we are clearly wrong, you can guess, we call it delusion. But most of the time, we are somewhere in between, with imprecise, incomplete, partly right, partly wrong, personally and socially biased perceptions and understanding of what is going on. Bevan Oatstone contributes thus: hallucinations versus imaginations. One is a dream you can see. The other doesn't happen to be. One is real as an orange candle weaving its flame flying through the sky. One's making the guy bigger who ended up punching your eye. Hallucinating hidden meanings in the palm of your hands. Imagining the consequences with fragments. One I believe, the other I conceive. Nishant Pant contributes: hallucinations are induced due to different reasons, which include insomnia, abuse of psychotropic substances, psychological disorders which can be passed through genes, and improper parenting. Yep. Imagination is a different thing altogether. However, uncontrolled imagination can lead to hallucination. Imagining itself is not an issue, but it depends on what one is imagining. And in most of the cases, the sufferer has no control over his or her imagination. There are lots of ways to get rid of these psychic anomalies. If one needs a cure, he or she will search for it. But the whole point is that the sufferer has no control over the mind and in turn is not able to make the appropriate decisions or right choices. Perhaps a mentor can solve much of the problems of the sufferer, says the writer. A mentor has to emphasize the situation and hence has to lead to the right direction. Patience is a key ingredient here and which has to exist inside the mentor's mind. Keeping the sufferer of constraint in a confinement is not the solution, neither giving heavy doses of antipsychotics can cure the problem. Although the small doses including clonazepam, propanol in case of psychosis, and escitalopram to make the mood stable can help. But again, this is a temporary way of handling things. A petty thing like concentrating on the tip of a flame can also give good results, he says. There are endless ways to get rid of the agitating problem. One has to just seek and be in pursuit of the unknown. David Bullock says, imagination is creative in putting what we know into more than intuitively thinking. I would say our imagination creates intuitional possibilities. Being who we are, we make things real. Hallucination may be unwilling. But another question arises herein. Are they all the same? Or some may be created from not leaving an idea alone, or call it determination. Imagination. This is entirely your creation, and you obviously will not believe anything that is part of it which exists. Illusion? Well, it is usually caused by someone or something else. Illusions are meant to trick you into believing something unreal, something false. Fantasy takes part from imagination and mythology and puts them together into an, hopefully, interesting story, if you're a writer. Hallucination is an illusion caused by various conditions, simply such as sleep deprivation and dehydration. Drink more water. Someone else contributed to the question of what is the difference between imaginary friends, daydreams, and hallucinations. Imagined friends are imaginary beings, mentally created by a person or even a child. They usually know they are not real, and they are able to control every aspect of their imaginary friends. Whereas daydreams are things you see in your mind's eye. These are controlled by your imagination and your mind. And again, usually they are likely to be controlled and are a sign of, yes, you guessed it right, creativity. Daydreams are healthy if they do not disrupt the daily life. Maladaptive daydreaming is also a thing, but can disrupt normal functioning and are not just normal daydreams. A person spends up to several hours or even days daydreaming non-stop to the point where it no longer allows them to function normally. And this is certainly unhealthy. Like maladaptive daydreaming, hallucinations are the things where one is able to sense and that they are not controlled. Unlike daydreams, the solutions involve all the senses. So they hear, see, touch, and smell things that are not really there. They are often caused by drugs, mental illness, grief, stress, and so forth. And they mess with your perception of reality, often making you feel lost or even confused. You see, having hallucinations is or can be very dangerous, and if you are having them, I suggest you seek help from a psychologist or psychiatrist, says the author of these words. And so I repeat, imagination is the start of thinking, and thinking makes us human. What is the real difference between seeing things mentally and hallucinogenically? Let us look at it in the view of, or in the light of neuroscience, shall we? We can see things visually and can imagine things in our minds where a hallucination is visually animated. Imagine having a round block sphere painted or placed upon a whiteboard, staying absolutely still, and that you are looking at it from a distance in a classroom without blinking, and you keep on looking at it for a while. Suddenly, you, as you wish, can make that ball or black sphere move side to side or up and down. Try, and you will be quite amazed. Believe me. The question is, how does that happen? If a person hallucinating is seeing what his or her mind has imagined, then does that mean that while in his hallucinogenic state, where imagination is being transposed under his visual image, then if he purposely imagined something else, would it rate his current hallucination with a new hallucination? Question. One might think that he may have thought this up or made up. Why? You see, if we concentrate, we can make something look to us as if it is moving, or we can make ourselves feel as if the earth is swinging side to side, backwards or forwards, up and down, and so. Unconscious, unintentional hallucinations seem much more powerful. But the question still remains, why? Someone else contributed saying that actually the brain is not a passive receptor of information. When you receive the information from or through the eyes, it may be compacted and sent through the optic nerve through to the brain, to us, and is an electromagnetic signal. It means a flow of information from the occipital cortex, where most of the visual areas are. Any questions remain unanswered for a long while. Why is this so? The information from the eyes can be compared to the working model of the real world which you are already predicting. You can see it all with the occipital lobe, explaining in the simplest way. But it may need to be updated. The signals the optic nerve provides help to update the model you have already in your brain. It tweaks it to reflect the signal being gathered or received. If we depend completely on the input from the eyes, and we were certainly not passive receptors of information, the brain will not be structured like that. We would need more brain power to process what we have been looking at or seeing. What we see is just useful representation of the world, but not completely trustworthy. If you can recall the white with gold, black with blue dress, for instance, it has to do with how your brain decides to handle the available information. The colors are not real. They are something the brain makes up using the frequencies it receives. Many things in our perception, which are actually illusions, and so we can accept it as they are being all right. However, when you hallucinate, you are allowing yourself to process something as an actual perception that could have been inhibited, and if you have the filters which are not correctly working, and some would associate this to an overly active dopamine system that is reflecting the real world when they are not. And a filter has a low threshold to select what is real and what is not. And when your thoughts emerge from what you are watching or listening to, the network is being overly active, generating some form of representations that should not be there, and they are not there at all. And so the difference is really the source. However, illusions happen all the time, as they are part of the visual processing system. But having a processing system like this, that is too lax in the control of the network activation, that can lead you to see even more things that are not there, like people coming out of people. To consider this psychedelic or hallucinations, which of the higher order representations, shapes, objects, faces, people need be stored endogenously in higher order or accessory visual cortical regions of the brain, which then send those representations back to primary visual cortex. In primary visual cortex, there's always a kind of balance between external sensory stimuli and corresponding the endogenous visual representations or even symbols. The serotonin system is apparently important for modulating the gain of this endogenous higher order pathway relative to the external sensory pathway. And hypothesis mechanism or visual psychedelic hallucinations is amplification of this endogenous feedback pathway, and a hypothesis mechanism or visual psychedelic hallucinations is amplification of this endogenous feedback pathway via stimulation of 5-HT2A receptors. Don't worry, I will not bother your mind with them. According to the author, this explains why smaller doses of psychedelics result in amplification of certain features of objects, and large doses result in progressively more generational features which do not actually exist because they are actually being completely generated in the higher order of visual pathway. There are also medications, which are drugs in their natural state and are used to treat or even cure or prevent diseases. But they all have, listen to this carefully, side effects, and some of which are adverse, and hallucinations also occur as a side effect of taking certain medications, as we mentioned them before. Hallucination is the perception of something that does not exist in reality. They can be perceived through any of the five senses, such as the sight, touch, smell, sense of scent, and taste. Some antidepressants, antihistamines, and antibiotics can cause hallucinations, and often when they are used altogether, they could exacerbate psychotic side effects. Antidepressants are the type of medications used to treat major depressive disorders, but they can be prescribed to treat other disorders like anxiety disorders or obsessive compulsive disorders. Bupropion, also sold as Wellbutrin, is known to be an antidepressant but can cause hallucinations, according to Korkmaz, as it was published in the Klondike Psychopharmacology Bulletin of Clinical Psychopharmacology in Turkey, Istanbul. Antidepressants have been linked to hallucination in cases of overdose. Antipsychotics are a type of medicine that is mainly used to treat psychosis-related conditions. According to Cleveland Clinic, there are two different generations of antipsychotic medications. First one is the typical antipsychotic, like chlorpromazine or tolazine, and haloperidol or Haldol were the first medications developed to treat psychosis. However, they are not used any longer. The second, atypical antipsychotics, such as aripiprazole or Abilify, and olanzapine or Zyprexa, are used more commonly as they seem to have lesser side effects. Antipsychotics are typically prescribed to decrease psychotic symptoms, like hallucinations, particularly those uncontrolled ones. But in some cases, these drugs might worsen hallucination symptoms, and has been documented in 2014. According to a report, the atypical antipsychotic olanzapine, sold as Zyprexa, is known to worsen the hallucination experience in a psychotic disorder. A thought to consider: hallucinations are not a common side effect of antipsychotic drugs. That's a fact. These drugs are usually used to relieve psychotic symptoms. Muscle reactions are a type of medication to alleviate muscle-related symptoms like spasms and spasticity. Tizanidine, sold as Xenaflex, is usually available on doctor's prescription only and cause hallucinations. According to American Addiction Center, hallucinations are considered as a common side effect or muscle relaxant overuse, and taking higher dosage is one of these could cause hallucinations. According to study, beta blockers prescribed to treat high blood pressure, since it forces the heart to be slower than normal by just lowering the blood pressure, cause side effects. However, patients who use such medications may experience at least one neuropsychiatric symptom that is based on hallucinations, delirium, and even depression. Another antihypertensive drug is lisinopril, sold as Zestrel, an ACE inhibitor that has recently reported of causing visual hallucinations. Antibiotics are a type of medication that is used to treat bacterial infections, as you may know. However, in some cases, the human body is able to kill bacteria without the need for antibiotics anyway. They are not prescribed for illnesses caused by viruses, as with, say, cold or flu. Research by Neurology magazine, published in 2016, reviewed reports of medications. A total of 54 different types of antibiotics were involved or considered. And the study concluded then roughly 47% of these patients had delusions or hallucinations. Anti-seizure or anticoagulant medications are used to treat epileptic seizures. These medications cannot cure epilepsy, as you know, or other related conditions. They are only to treat the seizure symptoms, and some have serious side effects. One anticonvulsant called levetiracetam, sold as Keppra, may induce hallucinations. In a 1996 case report in Psychiatry and Clinical Neuroscience Journal, it was reported that nitrazepam, sold as Mogadon, used for seizures, caused repeated hallucinations even after therapeutic doses, obviously causing some damage. Antihistamines are a type of medication, on the other hand, usually used to treat symptoms of allergies. There are two types of them, and are bound to two histamine receptors, and one type is used to treat gastrointestinal conditions, such as acid reflux or motion sickness. However, hallucinations have been linked to overdosing in usage of Benadryl, for instance. Indeed, Benadryl, although hallucinations are not a common side effect of antihistamines if the medications are taken correctly, as prescribed. Now, WebMD identify hallucinations as a rare but severe side effect of ibuprofen, sold as Advil, or Nurofen, available over the counter as a pain reliever, believe it or not. Hallucinations are not a common side effect of pain medications, but if a patient does experience hallucinations, it is usually to a very severe degree. Also consider that most episodes of hallucinations do not last longer than about an hour, as one can read in the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry. The most common causes of hallucinations are mental health disorders, such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. It is said nearly 70% of people diagnosed with schizophrenia experience visual or auditory hallucinations. Drugs, whether illegal or prescribed, and alcohol, especially mixed, are common causes of hallucinations. There are usually 5 types of hallucinations relating to one of the 5 senses: auditory, visual, tactile, olfactory, and gustatory. Auditory hallucinations are most common. Visual hallucinations involve seeing things that are not real. Tactile hallucinations involve seeing things, feeling, touch, and movement on your body, which are not real. Olfactory hallucinations involve experiencing smells which are not real. Gustatory hallucinations can cause unpleasant tastes which are not real. Antipsychotics are a type of medication that can be taken to avoid the risk of hallucinations. This medication can only be prescribed by a doctor, practicing doctor, when deemed necessary. It is possible to develop an addiction to medicines that cause hallucinations if they are overused. It is called hallucinogen addiction. Pain relief, sleep, antipsychotic medications are the most likely to be addictive to regular users of this type of medication. And so, I intend to stop here with this episode until we meet you again by the next episode. Until then, keep well, keep smiling. Do not hallucinate, I should say, and be happy. We will meet you again by the next episode. Thank you.